Before we dive into this episode of the podcast, I want to quickly address what's going on in the broader world around us this week. A significant and deadly global health emergency, has begun to directly impact breweries, beer events, and individuals involved in the craft beer industry. The response from industry groups like the Brewers Association, who just announced the cancellation of the Craft Brewers Conference scheduled for next month, has underscored the severity of the situation, and we ourselves just yesterday moved our Minnesota Craft Beer Festival back from its scheduled date in April to September 19th of this year in order to make sure everyone from attendees to brewery representatives, staff, and volunteers remain healthy and safe. The impact on breweries and the hospitality businesses that breweries depend on has the potential to be severe and long-lasting even after the most dangerous phase of this epidemic has passed. And so we'll continue to look for opportunities to engage on this subject in meaningful and timely ways. For now, we hope everyone listening is engaging in healthy practices, looking out for the health and safety of themselves and those around them. Together, we can get through this. Now, on to this week's episode. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder, and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing magazine, Jamie Bogner. I'm in Portland, Oregon this week, and sitting across the table from an award-winning brewer here at Breakside Brewery in Portland, Ben Edmunds, brewmaster for Breakside Brewery. Welcome to the podcast, Ben.
Thanks for having me, Jamie.
Looking forward to talking about a lot of things, not just the IPAs that you've won so many medals for, and that I know everyone is excited to hear about on this episode. We are absolutely going to talk about that, but we're also going to delve into some of your mixed culture beer and some of your other approaches to beer beyond that. You're about to celebrate your 10th anniversary this year?
Yeah, we opened in May of 2010, so we'll hit 10 years in just a few months.
That's quite a milestone.
Yeah.
It's going to be a fun conversation. I can't wait to talk and drink beer. First, as the brewing industry's premier choice for glycol chilling, G&D Chillers has set the standard on quality, service, and dedication to their customers' craft. G&D is committed to cold, whether you operate a brew pub or large-scale production brewery. They're big enough to produce and small enough to care. Call G&D Chillers to discuss your project today or reach out directly at gdchillers.com. Also, Old Orchard invites you to step up your fruit game with their premium craft juice blends. Whether you're planning a passion fruit Kolsch, Concord Sour, mango lager, or other fruity brew, Old Orchard can supply you with consistent product at affordable prices. Their blends are packed with real fruit and natural flavors with no added sugar or other weird fillers you'd find in knockoff brands. With the rising demand for fruity seltzers and brews, the time is ripe to grow your relationship with the right juice supplier. Get your Old Orchard sample kit today with free 6-pack cooler at www.oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, before we start talking, remember Craft Beer and Brewing's all-access subscriptions give you a year of print and digital editions of the magazine, plus access to our library of video courses, special deep dive email only for all-access subscribers, premium content, and an all-access exclusive merchandise item. Go to beerandbrewing.com, click on the subscribe button, support what we do right here, and join now. Ben, talk to me about your brewing history in the normal format that we start this thing off with. How did you get here as brewmaster for Breakside and Breakside Brewery, and making the beer that you do now?
Right. So I started, like many people of my kind of generation of brewers, as a home brewer. I started home brewing in college a little bit, and then dabbled in, I guess, in college, and then eventually kind of caught the bug, as a lot of people did. I was living in this small town in Colorado after college, my first job out of college, and I was teaching high school, and it was a great little mountain town. You could go skiing, rock climbing, mountaineering during the day, but at night there was nothing to do. It was, dead town. So homebrewing was a easy thing to kind of get into, and that was what my friends and I filled our time with.
Nobody brews in Colorado. I don't know what you're talking about.
There was a brew pub in this town in Leadville, Colorado. I think it's gone through 3 or 4 iterations since I moved there in 2004. So I think we probably produced about as much beer as the brew pub that was there at the time did. And so when I moved to Portland in 2007, I kind of had it in the back of my mind that I might want to try and make a career change and make a go of it and try and make a career out of my passion or my hobby, I suppose, and was very passionate about it. Really loved craft beer. Had gotten into craft beer a lot more in Colorado, and So when I moved out here, I quickly became enamored of the scene. Long story short is that I ended up enrolling at Siebel and had planned with a couple of friends to try and open our own place. That I was going to be the beer guy, one of them was going to be the restaurant guy, the other was going to be the business guy. Turns out that those two guys, while I was in brewing school, decided they really didn't like working with each other. And so that was probably one of the most luckiest things that happened to me, because I finished brewing school and held up my end of the bargain, came back to Portland, and a couple of different kind of opportunities arose around this, all kind of close to each other. One was that I was offered a job brewing kind of as an assistant brewer over at Upright Brewing here in Portland, and I did that for a little bit. I also shortly thereafter met the guys who were planning to open Breakside, then kind of brew pub and planning that was going to be a nano brewery, in a basement, and start going from there. And eventually, Breakside did open, and I was offered the position of being the pub brewer when we first started there. I had brewed it up right then, at that point, for about 6 or 8 months, and I thought that between brewing school education and working in another brewery, that running a 3-barrel brew pub was going to be easy and fun and totally manageable. And 10 years later, here we are, and I'm not really sure there's a lot of things that happened in the interim there, but I've been with Breakside now for 10 years.
So you've kind of driven that beer program from the very early days.
Yeah, and it's a real credit, I think, certainly to Scott Lawrence, who's now my business partner and the founder of Breakside. That, he enters it more from the hospitality side, and wants high quality beer, high quality food, high quality customer experience, and he was not dogmatic and never has been about what we make. And I think that's really allowed for me and the other brewers at Breakside to have kind of carte blanche to innovate.
And so now you're multiple locations, you're doing some significant scale production that gets out there into the world of distribution. How large is the brewery right now overall?
We're right around 30,000 barrels.
Yeah, that's not so small anymore.
No,
so
we got out of the basement
from a 3-barrel system. Yeah. So one of the things that puts you on the map are your hoppy beers. It's we're on the West Coast. IPAs are incredibly popular. You all have staked out some ground, making particularly good versions of those. Walk me through that, that early kind of ideation process as you were thinking about the kinds of IPAs you're going to make, and then let's kind of work through how they got to where they are now.
Sure.
Because none of these beers start as the things they are, from that first get-go. I mean, I guess some do, but for most brewers, it's a process of iteration, a process of refinement, a process of understanding your equipment and what you're making it on, and then also learning and understanding those ingredients as you do more and more of this and get to taste more and more of those impacts. Talk to me a little bit about that initial vision for the IPA and then how that has developed over the last decade.
So in 2008, 2009, when we opened, just before we opened, I would say that if you look back at that point in time, in terms of really progressive, aromatic, exciting IPAs, there was more coming out of California than there was in Oregon or Washington at the point. The highest quality stuff, in my mind, having lived in Colorado and been to GABF, of course there's Russian River, and of course there's Firestone.
Right.
There's also, I think, the Pizza Port beers. So I think that for me, in my mind, I had, going into brewing school and coming back and as a home brewer, had this vision that, having been lucky enough to taste some of these, top-notch West Coast IPAs in their heyday, was, I think, a really foundational thing. And so it's aspirational, right? At that point, you say, I don't want to do anything less than that. And they were more bitter, for sure. A lot of those beers were quite a bit, very dank, very resinous, very bitter, very high, much higher alcohol. I think that still is the case in a lot of San Diego style West Coast IPAs. You start at that, 7% is kind of your basement.
Right.
And so for Breakside, the vision was always to make those beers, to kind of take the best of those beers, but bring them down a little bit to a more drinkable ABV level.
Right.
And kind of I don't know that it's really appropriate to call a 6.5% beer sessionable, but relative to a 7.5% beer, it is. So
you can sell 4 of them instead of 3.
Sure, yeah. I don't know how everyone in San Diego can drink those high alcohol beers and still, function and surf so well and, look so healthy. It's amazing.
They started doing it before Uber existed too, so I don't know.
Anyhow, that was kind of where we were the target that we were
right.
shooting for, right? Was this idea of a beer that was kind of more in the 6 to 6.5% range, and that was pretty consistent with the other IPAs that were on in the Portland market at the time. And so, taking a little bit of the kind of aromatics from San Diego and from Northern California, a little bit more of the kind of malt base, though not quite as much crystal malt as maybe some of the earlier IPAs that there were. I think that was kind of where we started, and we started working down that path, that direction. And Breakside IPA was the first IPA that we made. To this day, it remains a Citra Chinook and Mosaic beer. When we first started brewing it, it was actually a Citra Chinook, so that really did kind of hit its its hop schedule pretty early on.
You were on the front end of that whole Citra train then.
Well, the irony of it was that we couldn't get Simcoe. I wanted to make a Simcoe Chinook beer, and we didn't have hop contracts, of course, when we first opened, so I wanted to make a Simcoe Chinook beer, and I couldn't get Simcoe, but I could get Citra on the spot market.
Yeah.
And that lasted for about a year.
Until everyone else figured it out, too.
Yeah, and then there was probably a year or so where, we were really scraping the bottom of the barrel. I think there were probably some batches of Breakside IPA that were like Fuggles and Northern Brewer, But finally our hop contracts kicked in, and we were probably one of the smallest brew pubs to have hop contracts, but we had Citra and Mosaic in abundance after that. And so Citra Chinook became kind of the foundation of that beer. I didn't really ever think about it until, this was never intentional, but I think it certainly is reflected in my preference, and also Jacob Leonard, who's our director of brewing operations, has been with Breakside for nearly 8 years now. Neither of us are big into like ganja aromatics. And so I think that
although that vibe is pretty thick here in Oregon, and Washington for that matter.
Yeah, and I don't think it's not really a commentary on whether anyone on our staff, enjoys or doesn't enjoy pot. It's more just like, do you want your IPAs to smell that way?
Yeah.
Is that like a signature aromatic? And that was something we actually realized pretty quickly we didn't like.
Okay.
So I think that is something that differentiated our beers early on. We were working with hops in ways where we were looking for combinations that were more fruity, more tropical, less dank resinous.
Yeah. Now, the Chinook thing is still something that I find a lot of Oregon brewers run with, that brewers outside of the state don't seem to use quite as often. What do you find Chinook added to that mix?
Chinook, when it's good, has a really distinctive ruby red grapefruit and sweet pine character. I think that some of the Chinook, not just from particular farms, but a lot of the Chinook being grown in Oregon, and frankly in Yakima now too, has that quality. The best Chinook does. It's a punchy hop, right?
Yeah.
We've found over the years that you really have to keep either lower the amount of Chinook you're using, and you'll still get a lot of bang for your buck, or if you want to have a Chinook forward beer, it really needs to be couched with some pretty high TG.
Yeah.
We actually do I like to call it a Northeast by Northwest kind of IPA. It's not New England IPA because it's not sweet, but it's hazy, and it's rich, and it's a Chinook forward beer called Thirst Trap. And it's definitely kind of our stamp on a hybrid of the two styles, but it's not juicy at all. It's not, it's very Chinook forward. But if you let that TG get too low in some Chinook beers, especially again Chinook heavy beers, I think that you get a lot of woodiness, a lot of cedariness. It's something that in Breakside IPA, it's actually within our kind of senior panel, is something we're very sensitive to. Is if we feel like the TG is dropping, or we're seeing we'll move that TG back up. We're trying to always kind of balance residual sugar and Chinook character, because the Citra and the Mosaic kind of take care of themselves in some ways, as long as you have good Citra Mosaic.
It's an interesting way to think about how that gravity affects the expression of those hops. I think you're absolutely right, and I notice that even now with so many brewers brewing hazy IPAs, kind of pushing into that 8% to mid-8s range with double IPAs. That extra bit of sweetness sells that juicy character and helps bring out that character of those hops. As a brewer, you want to be able to, get that character out of any beer along the ABV spectrum, but it doesn't always work that way. Yeah,
and with all due respect to the brewed IPA as a phenomenon, really, in my mind, the only interesting part of it, from a novel part of it from a flavor profile point of view, is that it makes me at least think about how different hops present themselves in a very, very low sugar environment. You know, that's kind of the most interesting piece of it.
What have you found around that? Are there specific hops that you really have to go to that can find some of that juicier tropical character despite that lack of residual sugar?
To be honest, those beers haven't sold well enough for us. We've really stopped producing them.
I think that's the entire market right now. Brewed IPA was the hottest trend that never became anything.
Right.
Yeah, we'll share some blame for writing about it and promoting it. But you got to try. You mentioned pulling caramel malt out of it as you do it, and that's certainly a trend that has been accelerating over the last 5 to 7 years. Both for the oxidative reasons that pulling some of those malts out certainly helps stabilize these beers over the long run and reduce oxidation, but it also kind of amplifies this brightness to the hops character that kind of differentiates from that older pale ale kind of approach that people were really firm with. It was almost this new generation's break with that generation of the past. Talk to me a little bit about how you envision this malt bill and how the malt and those hops work together as a result of it.
So when we first started making Breakside IPA in 2000, I want to say the very first batch was probably end of 2010 or beginning of 2011. It was C40, Munich, 2-row, and I believe some Carapils. And the C40 was probably about 8% of the grist at the time. Fast forward 10 years, and there's no C40 in the beer, but there is a good bit of C20. And for a long, long time, including the times when it won at GABF, the beer had C40, C20, Munich, and 2-row. And now it is just Munich, 2-row, and C20. So we do actually keep some crystal malt in there.
Yeah.
Though I don't think there's a single West Coast or East Coast kind of hop forward beer that we make at this point where there's anything darker than a 20 Lovibond malt.
Is that just for color reasons or flavor reasons or for functional reasons?
All of the above. I think that it adds a little bit of crystal malt, does add a really pleasant hue to a lot of these beers. It takes it from potentially being, especially if you're talking about a hazy beer, I think goes from that kind of chicken stock like character that you risk sometimes. And that's fine. I mean, we have a beer across the table there that has, effectively that hue. But I think a little bit of an orange hue, a copper hue is really pleasant. Structurally, I think it does add some non-fermentability, and that's an important piece of these beers, depending on what sort of hop load you're trying to include in there, what types of hops. Again, if you're trying to include some of the Chinook, you get all the best of Chinook, but you get the roughest parts too. So you have to work with that and find ways to counteract it.
What do you find is that kind of ideal final gravity spot for these?
It really varies for us. I would say
we're talking about West Coast.
Yeah, if we're talking about West Coast IPAs that are in the kind of the Breakside sweet spot of like the 6 to 6.4 range, typically we're between like 2.3 and 2.7.
Okay.
Yeah, we're not. We don't go below 2, or really try and not ever go below 2.
Yeah.
Just as we plan recipes, those beers tend to be too dry, too thin. If we were making 7% IPAs, kind of like, Evan Price was on the show recently and talked about this with Green Cheek, where it's, he's getting those beers very dry, or like the guys at Comrade doing the same thing. They make very dry beers.
Right.
I think that we would have to just compose the beer differently. So a lot of it, I don't think it's necessarily a right answer.
Sure.
But for us, the way that we do some other things in terms of water profile, in terms of malt composition, in terms of hop loads, I think that for us, that 2.2 to 2.7 is that sweet spot.
Yeah. I never want anyone to give me a pronouncement about how all things should be. All I ever want is to know how you do it.
Yeah.
And I think that everyone is just trying to find that perspective. It's not that they want to do the same thing. It's just interesting to hear, how you create that kind of balance in what you do. From that malt perspective, you mentioned 2-row Munich. Are there some particular varieties that you like more than others that kind of add some of that character that helps, hold that beer up?
Our silo malt is Great Western 2-row. That's pretty much the foundational malt that we use in all of our West Coast beers. They malt it just across the river here in Vancouver, Washington. It's a really clean, neutral base malt, moderately high protein, but not over the top. So a really clean, easy to use and friendly base malt. As far as Munichs go, we mix it up. We like Weirmann Munich 1 quite a bit. We use a lot of Great Western Munich malt. Baird's Munich we bring in by the container load and use that as kind of the only malt other than 2-row and Wanderlust.
Okay.
So there's a handful of other, and we'll use Simpson's Munich, which if I recall right is a little bit darker. But those are kind of maybe the 4 that we rotate through the most. There are some other ones that you'll see in our recipes from time to time.
Sure. Because you're a brewer and you like to have fun and try some new things here and there.
We try and streamline, but you know, there's always a stray bag of something here or there in the warehouse.
Yeah. Speaking of streamlining, talk to me a little bit about yeast. Are you all public about the yeast strain that you use in your West Coast
Yeah,
IPAs?
it's a 001 beer. Yeah.
Okay. It's just some straight. Yeah. Okay. When you talk about water treatment, you're certainly trying to kind of heighten that that sharpness and definition in it. Is there anything special to what you do about that?
I don't think there's anything in particular that's like that unique that we do. I mean, we moderately Burtonize the water.
Yeah.
As far as sulfate to chloride ratios go, 2-to-1 to 5-to-1 is kind of our sweet spot. I don't think it really changes hop flavor at all, or it doesn't do much to enhance hop aroma. I do think it promotes drinkability.
Yeah.
I know that some people really prefer a chloride-forward beer. That's on our West Coast IPAs. That's just not how we roll.
Right.
And for us, just a little bit of that and a little more gypsum or a little bit more sulfate, I should really say, to chloride is important. We also, it's interesting, we have 2 pubs in Portland and 1 down our production breweries in Milwaukee, Oregon, which is the first suburb south of town, and that's on a different municipal water supply. Okay. So when we built this brew pub that we're sitting in, which is our Slabtown pub, which is kind of our hop experiment, our hop lab, as we call it sometimes, we started making beers here and realized, even though we were Burtonizing for gypsum, for sulfate and chloride, that we were missing something. The beers were coming out a little bit soft, and Portland water really has very little salt in it and mineral content in it at all. Our water down in Milwaukee is quite high in bicarbonate. It's quite hard water, alkaline water. And so we, just as a matter of course, to try and flavor match, started adding a little bit more chalk into our beer here. And I think that's become part of our flavor profile here now, too, that we really like, mainly to flavor match between R&D recipes and production recipes. But I would suggest to anyone who hasn't tried it before that if see what adding a little bit of calcium carbonate into your hoppy beers can do on your West Coast IPAs.
I'm going to talk. The next big question is more of a theoretical and an abstract question, and that's how you go from making these beers to dialing in beers that have such an impact in kind of competition. But before we get to that question, the founders launched SS Brewtech with a very clear goal to advance brewing equipment design, performance, and quality to the very highest standards in the industry, with a team that draws upon strong functional backgrounds in brewing science, mechanical engineering, industrial design, supply chain, and manufacturing. SS Brewtech has the people and skill sets you want and expect from your supplier of pro brewing equipment. Head over to ssbrewtech.com for more information on their brew houses and brewing gear. And now, a special message from Pabst Brewing Company.
Out of the west, a storm surprised. Swept down on Captain Pabst. That mariner and gentleman, his action swift and fast. He sailed the seabird against the throes, routing twain wind and fear. He took haste to protect his kin, but the port was far from near. Pabst's intuition proved him right, and bore a friendly coast. The mighty seabird crashed aground, and to that we raise a toast. For while the seabird indeed was lost, safe were kin and crew, and without this mighty ship to steer, Captain Pabst began to brew. Captain Pabst, Seabird IPA, exclusively available in Wisconsin and Chicago.
So talk to me about this, the kind of the je ne sais quoi, the kind of the element that doesn't get accounted for in recipes, and even in that thing that takes a beer from being a good, solid seller to being that thing that gets elevated as a paragon of IPA in the world of brewing.
When we talk about beers that we enter in competition, and it doesn't just apply to our IPAs, but I think about the thing that I like about competition is that I think I've learned over time that the beers that win, the beers that advance, are the beers that are the most pleasant. And they're the most pleasant to a very discriminating group of judges. As someone who judges, GABF, other competitions, I see it as, within the purview of the style guidelines, there's going to be 12 beers in front of us. Obviously we can't go rogue and ignore the guidelines, but we're going to find that the beers that are going to advance are the ones that are the most pleasant to the most people. And if you can shave your beers in ways that are optimizing for being the most pleasant, they're going to do well. And obviously there's a lot more to it than that, but I think that's fundamentally our philosophy on this. Like, is this pleasant to everyone at our table? And we nitpick our beers the most, in our own sensory team, our own kind of seniors sensory panel every week. So but we always come back to that question. You and I might think this recipe is great, it's dialed in, but if we have our QA manager who's over here saying, this bitterness is a little bit rough to me, it's not necessarily about trying to just like alter the recipe altogether, but it's like, okay, what can we shave? What can we do to make this a little bit more pleasant for this person here and that person there? And I think that we're kind of, I suppose a cynic could hear that and think that means you're kind of taking the character out of a beer, or you're taking kind of the individual like imprint of the brewer's intent out of it, but I don't think that's the case. We're just trying to make people.
Your goal is to make beer that makes people happy.
Yeah,
right?
make people want to drink and that they enjoy. So I think that is really what I enjoy about both getting feedback from competitions and entering competitions. And when we succeed in them, I think it's because we've taken that to heart and try and just simply take any beer once it's been created and then ask that question again and again. Okay, this is a good beer. This is coming along. How can it be more pleasant?
At the same time, and there is still that balance that you're talking about a lot of beers in any given flight, and it's not just hitting a lowest common denominator for the most unoffensive thing. There also has to be a character that stands out as interesting and engaging, and something that kind of captivates the judges, because yes, they are not looking for the small things that might knock something out of a round, but they're also wanting to push something forward that has something to say and that somehow accomplishes this ideal of the thing. And so while you're shaving off, you're also trying to kind of push this middle character of something up through the middle.
And what is that? Is that the?
I don't know that there's a single thing, but I'm just curious. From your perspective, what does that thing become?
Again, I go back to pleasure. I go back to just the simple enjoyment of the beer in so many ways. Once you know that you're kind of within the framework of a given style, it's and I think you're kind of playing in this sweet spot of like, how do you just make it more pleasant? And the greatest compliment I think that at this point in my career I can give to another brewer is that like someone's beer is so good that it makes me stop thinking about beer.
Yeah.
Right. That it's just want to enjoy it.
Sure.
So if you can, I think that's the quest. I don't know. We changed our approach to getting there each time, I suppose. Sometimes it's water profile, sometimes it's hop level, sometimes it's, identifying issues in fermentation. But I think that it's just a philosophical quest is more than it is about kind of having a secret like technique or anything like that.
Sure.
I mean, to be fair though, I will say, packaging is number one.
Yeah.
You have to have your beer has to show up on the table and be tasting fresh. Oxidation is the greatest enemy of otherwise good beers.
And it's going to sit there in a chilled warehouse for a month after it's packaged. Before it gets judged.
Yep. So I think that if that is the first thing you have to be able to address, but once you've addressed that, then you're really allowed. It's really just about this quality of the beer in front of you.
Does that impact the way that you kind of just? Even thinking about hops, there are certain hops combinations that you can design and processes that you push towards that'll taste great the week you release that beer, and there are some ways of brewing where you're thinking about the way that's going to express 4 weeks down the line when it all kind of comes together. And for a brewery that packages beer and puts it out into retail distribution, thinking about it coming together down the line after it's out of a distributor's warehouse and is sitting on a shelf and actually gets bought by someone. That's not a bad thing. It's a smart thing to think about. Building a beer that will come together in the time frame that it typically takes to get to a consumer, and that time frame does tend to get properly mapped or similarly mapped for these kinds of competition entries. How do you think about that kind of function?
Sure, yeah. I mean, we're a packaging brewery, right? And it would be silly for us if we didn't think about when were our consumers, or when's our average consumer finding and having this beer.
Yeah.
And I remember when we were first starting into production, first packaging our beer for anything other than draft, we were going to... I was going to the supermarket and I would just look at date codes and see, okay, how long is it actually taking to get to consumers? And we became laser focused on, okay, this beer's the average Portlander who's drinking Breakside IPA or Wanderlust is getting that at 25 days.
Yeah.
Let's not worry about the first 20 days. If it tastes good in that time, it's great. If it tastes like crap in that time, that's okay too. I mean, ideally it doesn't, but we want it to peak. We want it to be hitting that sweet spot for that consumer who's getting it between day 20 and day 40. And that really is the utmost concern to us. I half jokingly say, like, I don't care what the beer tastes like at 15 days, or if you drink one of our beers that quickly, you're kind of the anomaly. But I do think that production breweries should think about pipeline in that way. Pipelining quality is intertwined in that way.
Is there a piece beyond simply reducing dissolved oxygen in the beer that helps you accomplish that? Did you adjust hops in any way? Did you adjust any other components of your process or recipe?
Sure. There are certainly some hops that I think hang on longer than others that seem to have a good shelf life in terms of kind of their impact.
Right.
Centennial is an interesting hop because that seems to just last and last and last and last. And a beer that might sit on a store shelf warm, you open it and it still smells like Centennial if it's got a good amount of Centennial in it. And maybe it doesn't smell like the most beautiful, perfect, fresh Centennial that you had in that 20-day beer that had been stored cold, but it smells more like hops than some other beers that were treated the same that don't have that same hop combination, have the same, you control for all the other variables. I do think Chinook does the same thing. I think some of the older school hops actually hang on really nicely. Fortunately, I think that Citron Mosaic, when handled well, I mean, most hops when handled well, I think that people are using these days hang on well. There are some that I personally feel like kind of disappear and drop off. We've been having a lot of issues with El Dorado as of late, where it smells so wonderful for the first 20 days, and then it's just kind of absent after that. It's not bad. It's just like, where'd it go? I've always felt the same way about Azacca. Two hops that, at the table, they smell great. They smell great in the wort. They smell great in the bag of pellets smells great. The wort smells great. The beer smells great initially. And then 25 days later, you're kind of wanting for that hop.
So those become pub brew only or draft only, in your local spot kind of beers?
Well, see, I maybe it's just the way we brew, but I thought that we would figure out when we opened a brew pub that was supposed to be hop focused how to make our hoppy beers taste better at day 1, but we don't. I mean, they still taste better. I swear they always taste better at day 15, day 20. And we're pretty old school in our selling practices. We don't filter centrifuge, but we do. Everything goes, gets transferred. Everything's treated in a bright tank. Everything gets fined. And so even our hazy beers do. And so I don't know. Despite trying to make our beers be kind of better, younger, we've been unable to do that. But fortunately, the flip side, we've, I think, made our beers last longer, better.
Makes sense. Let's talk about one of the interesting things I think you have, and we're drinking Wanderlust IPA now. You have 2 almost flagship IPAs now that are pushed out there into production with different characters to each.
Yeah.
How did you envision, now that you had Breakside IPA and you've won medals for it, this other IPA that was somehow important enough to you and a different enough flavor profile to create a different idea of the beer? How did you envision that one and then start pushing this one forward?
Yeah, well, historically, Wanderlust actually came online before Breakside IPA had ever really taken off.
Okay.
It was 2013, and we had limited hop contracts, and we couldn't. Breakside IPA was doing well, but there was only a certain amount of IPA that we could produce that year. It certainly was not selling like hotcakes at the time. It was probably not even in the top 5 or 6 IPAs in our distributor's book. We were actually selling much more Pilsner at the time out of production, draft Pilsner, and 22s of Pilsner. And so, but at the same time, we wanted to go into the Seattle market. We wanted to do something other than Oregon, just add some additional territory to try and build up the brand and the name of the kind of notoriety of the brewery. And we came up with the idea to just add a second IPA because we couldn't make any more Breakside IPA given our hop contracts at that point. So it was just kind of a cap. And so Wanderlust was developed out of that effort. Oddly enough, we had a lot of Mosaic that we weren't using at the time because we just didn't have a home for it yet. We'd contracted because it smelled awesome at some CBC way back when. And I was fortunately chased our sales rep down in the hallway and said, I want to sign a contract for as much of that as I can get. And we weren't using it. So Wanderlust was born from that idea. And it really is, I think, if Breakside IPA, at least in its earliest iteration, maybe less so now, was kind of cut from a little bit of that backward-looking, late aughts type IPA. Wanderlust, I think, in a lot of ways was kind of one of the first Oregon IPAs that moved kind of forward in really getting rid of all the crystal malt, being a Mosaic forward IPA. It's Mosaic, Amarillo. There's a little bit of Summit in there, which we tell people that, and they think we're crazy, but there is Summit in that beer. There's a lot of Cascade in that beer still, too, and a little bit of Simcoe as well. But it's always been kind of a Mosaic forward beer.
I think there's something to that kind of use of classic hops that makes them feel familiar while you're still pushing forward. Is there another functional reason outside of that to kind of tap into some of those, like Cascade?
I agree that it's anchoring the beer in familiarity. Jacob Leonard, again, our director of brewing ops, he always likes to talk about it as kind of the just classic flavors or this base that you can riff off of.
Yeah.
And that when you start using beers, and that sometimes when you make IPAs or hoppy beers that are, all Southern Hemisphere or all Citra Mosaic, and maybe that's different, now. Maybe Citra Mosaic and Simcoe are the new holy trinity, right, of hops. So they're classic enough. But like for a long time there, if you didn't have Cascade or if you didn't have something like a little bit more C hop old school, it just didn't quite taste like IPA still. So we've always used those hops because I do think they anchor the beer in something very classic and very identifiable.
It's like this warm blanket that just, wraps around you and makes you feel like this is the way it's supposed to be. But I think, we're even watching it happen on the hazy IPA side where some of the more interesting brewers of hazy IPAs are starting to tap into, things like noble hops and English hops to add some interesting characters and finding new ways to use those that also feels familiar, but also slightly herbal or, floral, but having those characters kind of complement this expected kind of Citra Mosaic, Citra Galaxy kind of thing. At the end of the day, to keep it interesting, you've got to do something different. If everyone's making the same Citra Mosaic IPA and on the hazy side, it gets pretty boring pretty quickly.
Yeah, and it seemed to me, at least from the outside, that a lot of brewers who focus a lot on hazy beers tend to kind of discount or not really consider a lot of classic C hops that, they're just not interested in using them. So it's not surprising to hear that, you see people wanting to go to European varietals potentially as an alternative because there is only so much you can do with the same set of 4 or 5 hops.
Sure. We had Chris Betts from Transient Arts and Ales talking about Michigan Chinook and his hazy IPAs. Same kind of thing, like finding interesting ways of creating different kinds of character out of the things that most people may not be looking at for that kind of thing. There are some interesting approaches. Let's talk a little bit about your approach to hazy IPA, though. You make a bunch of these because obviously people like to drink these in addition to your West Coast IPAs. Talk to me a little bit about that kind of pivot and that addition to your portfolio and how you stake out a kind of unique territory that feels like Breakside in this world of hazy IPA.
Sure. We originally started, when we first kind of went down the path of really diving into hazy IPA, I think the moment that it clicked for me to understand what we could do is having this beer from Sun River Brewing Company out of Sun River, Oregon, actually, just south of Bend. They had made a what they called an India wheat ale, and it kind of was like a hybrid American Hefeweizen, American IPA. And up until that point, a lot of the New England IPAs I had, and I'd had a good number of them, were, a lot of them I felt like had replaced traditional bitterness with a bizarre astringency. Oftentimes there were a lot of yeast characteristics that I was not that into. Right. And I at first did not find those beers pleasant at all. And I think that brewers across the country have come a long, long way with those beers
Sure,
for sure.
sure.
But when, the thing that convinced me that there was something different and something interesting to do was having the Sun River beer. And so that was kind of the inspirational beer. And I remember taking that back to our team and talking about that beer. It's like, what if, if we thought about hazy IPA as the next iteration of American Hefeweizen, if Rob and Kurt Widmer were to brew Widmer Hefeweizen for the first time in 2016 and not in 1985 or 1986, what would they have brewed? And it probably would have been something that was like Hefeweizen but very heavily dry hopped with citron mosaic, right?
Right.
And so that's kind of where we started. And I actually think to this day that if you basically do that formula where you make a good kind of a stronger version of American wheat beer with a lot of wheat and use a good healthy dry hop, you can end up with a pretty decent attack on that style. And
you can almost look at, in some ways I think that like Three Floyd's Gumball Head
absolutely
wheat beer was one of these kind of progenitors of this entire style that, think about that beer back in the day. They kind of used some of these new hops, but also kind of heightened that with the kind of, yeast ester profile and that kind of banana highlighting these kind of tropical fruit notes in the hops.
Absolutely.
Yeah, sure.
And as we have advanced in our kind of production of those beers and, understanding the beers, tasting other people's versions of them, our thinking on the whole style has definitely evolved. Fortunately, I think there's also a lot of really awesome research that's been done on, both in hop science and on these beers in particular that has motivated us to keep refining them. And so, what we're really interested in now is kind of looking at like the composition of a hazy beer as just completely different from a West Coast IPA. Huh. And, it's not necessarily about bitterness and it's not necessarily about softness and not just about yeast profile, but viewing kind of the haze itself as a carrier of different hop compounds that you can't get in a West Coast IPA, that you're fundamentally getting two different kind of sets of flavors. And, there are, as I mentioned before, some hazy IPAs that we make that I would consider more West Coast in the sense that the way the hops present are that's more pellety, it's more West Coasty, and it's less of these kind of I think the term biotransformation gets bandied about a lot, but biotransformative compounds or some of the esters and some of the various compounds that you can get from using hops in a different way, and some of the component parts of hops that are carrying through in hazy IPAs.
Are there some particular things that you think you've picked up on over the last year of brewing these kinds of things that you may have been counterintuitive or may have kind of caught you off guard?
I think a lot of it is more about what doesn't work in those beers.
Okay, fair enough.
And trying to identify how to maximize kind of the perception again of like a juiciness or a sweetness, like as opposed to a kind of pellety, more West Coast style.
Yeah. Is that what the folks here drinking them want? I mean, they want that, or is there space in that? Talk to me a little bit about how you build that kind of West Coasty character into some hazy IPAs.
A lot of it, I think, is just well, you can start with bitterness. Let's start there, right? I mean, I think just people in Portland still do like bitter, more bitterness than I think you see elsewhere in the country.
Yeah.
Our customers want a beer with a little bit of firm bitterness, and part of that's, it's the home of Northwest IPA, and you have a lot of customers who for 20, 30 plus years have been drinking these beers this way. So Breakside IPA and Wanderlust, as well as Stay West and Rainbows and Unicorns, which are all West Coast IPAs, all outsell our top hazy IPA. And I think that if you went around town, other than maybe Great Notion, who really just focuses exclusively on those beers, I don't think you're going to find anyone in Portland who's not selling more West Coast IPA than hazy IPA right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, getting back to the composition question, I think...
So it's not like West Coast IPA is back. It never left.
Yeah, it never... I mean, I think it's a sign of a mature market here is that, everyone's made hazy IPAs. They're widely available, and you don't see people like going... It's not like there's a complete rejection of the past or of... People enjoyed their IPAs here enough to want to keep drinking them.
Yeah.
And that's true throughout Oregon.
And so staking out, even when you do hazy IPAs, staking out some of that kind of West Coast and Breakside feel, are there, some specific ways that you combine hops to kind of pull that in and make them, your thing outside of this kind of sweeter, fruitier, juicier thing that seems to be most East Coast dominated?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing you can do is you can lower your TG and you can raise your bitterness a little bit while still maintaining.
What would you shoot for in bitterness or those kind of things?
I mean, you might go, like, let's take two beers that we make, for example, What Rough Beast, which is our kind of flagship hazy IPA. That beer, I want to say, is about 48 BUs and is about 6.7%. With a TG in the mid threes, right?
Mid threes, that's super dry for a hazy IPA.
For that style, yeah. But like Thirst Trap, for example, is even a little bit drier than that, down in the high twos, and that is, if you push those BUs up, that's again that Chinook forward hazy. That's probably in the 50s. So by all accounts, pretty low for a IPA,
right?
But for a hazy IPA, quite high. So you get this kind of interesting interaction. You get all the richness in the mouthfeel. You get a lot of the compounds that you would not necessarily be able to get just in a West Coast IPA, but the bitterness and the dryness on the back end is very West Coast. Again, you can play with water profile too.
Sure.
You go a little bit, you can make a hazy IPA with some added skewing your sulfate to chloride a little bit towards sulfate. You don't have to just favor chloride in those beers, and you can create the perception of kind of more snappiness, more drinkability, while still getting some of the positives in mouthfeel.
Yeah. Are there any other trends that you're finding in the world of IPA before we shift gears here?
Yeah, I'm fascinated by some new hops that are in the marketplace right now. I'm really interested in the resurgence of pale ale. We seem to be able to sell a good bit of pale ale.
Really?
I hope that that's something that continues.
Is this caramel malt forward pale ale like the old days, or is this some new iteration of
No, I would call
ale?
these are new West Coast pales.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it just the lower lower ABV and greater, like, more ability to drink more of them, or is this part of the health craze where people are looking for lower calorie beers?
I don't know that I have that much insight into what the impetus is, but be able to. I mean, these are not as heavily dry hopped, but still pretty healthily dry hopped beers, and they're not as light or low alcohol as session IPAs. But again, they're not that different either. I think it just in general, it's like lower alcohol hoppy beers, hop forward beers that people seem to be excited about.
Yeah,
in a way that for a little while they weren't.
Interesting. It's exciting to see that come back because it's something that definitely should be there in that kind of pantheon of beers. You mentioned your Pilsner being one of your top sellers, and you've got a bottle of it here. And so obviously the lager trend is something that has seemed to be hitting pretty hard over the last 2 years. Mm-hmm. And this time I think it's actually a real thing where people are actually buying these. Mm-hmm. And obviously if that was a top seller that many years ago, it's been something that's always sold for you. Talk to me a little bit about your approach to brewing a Pilsner.
Yeah, so our Pilsner is a German-style Pils. That said, you do what I would call kind of a more American hop schedule with it. Okay. It's not dry hopped, but it is a kind of 60-minute, like start of boil, 10-minute before end of boil, and a whirlpool edition, as opposed to, say, a more traditional German of like a start of boil, 30 minutes before end of boil, and 15 minutes before end of boil. And we actually did a side-by-side years ago with our staff where we did 2 batches, and kind of everyone just preferred the American, American one, which interestingly has made it probably less of a competition beer in that sense, but everyone really loves it. So we it's just our Pilsner. It's kind of a German contemporary American Pilsner hybrid, but it's all Hersbrucker, majority Hersbrucker, a good bit of Liberty, which is an Oregon-grown kind of American noble, and some Hallertau Mittelfrüh in there. 100% Pilsner malt. It's naturally carbonated. We spooned it about halfway through fermentation. We ferment in 120 barrel tanks predominantly. We occasionally do 60 barrel batches, but because of that tank geometry, there are some considerations as far as what temperature we have to be at to spoon, doing diacetyl rises, some production considerations. So we typically go in at 48 degrees, ferment at 50 degrees, and then we'll do a VDK rise about 50% of the way through fermentation to a 57, and then we're spooning just after that. And usually that gets us to the beers to about 2.4 in 120 barrel tanks, or 2.2 is probably closer. We've been trying some techniques to try and get that a little higher to get full carbonation, but then we just top up in the bright tank.
Yeah. Any techniques that you're using on the kind of mash side in order to build some character? You're not decocting.
No, our German pils not decocted. We do a step mash on everything, but yeah, we step from kind of a beta amylase rest up all the way through mash out.
Is there a particular Pilsner malt that you find yourself attracted to?
We use Weyermann pils predominantly. There's their classic German pils. Yeah. That's the base for our pils, our Breakside Pilsner. But as far as other ones would go, I mean, we'll use the Weyermann Bohemian Pilsner. We'll use the Canada Malting Superior Pils, another one that we're really big fans of. So we'll mix those in for pub beers, and a lot of the pub lagers use those malts just to kind of mix it up.
Yeah. Staking out a territory in Pilsner is kind of a tough thing to do. I mean, there was a recent, I think it was a Hard Times joke story that went out about, guy starts a brewery to sell $9.50 Pilsners. Talk to me about how you make a beer like that compelling to a craft beer consumer.
That's a great question. Fortunately for us, Pilsner as a category is pretty accessible to our and meaningful to our customers here. I know that elsewhere in the country that isn't always the case, but we were lucky that there was enough recognition of that as a craft style even in 2013 when we started making it as a production beer, that it sold several thousand barrels per year.
Wow.
Right from the get-go. As far as kind of uniqueness of any pils, I mean, I think Pilsner is a much more wide-ranging style than a lot of people think. You have your more austere and kind of lean versions. I think of the Freem Pils, made just up the road in Hood River. It's very lean. It's very dry. It's very, again, austere is kind of the word that I think of. And then you have much more robust ones, even within the spectrum of German Pilsners, where you get a little bit more doughiness, a little bit more sweetness, a little bit lower bitterness. I mean, I was in Germany last year, and Augustiner Pils actually surprised me by how non-bitter it was.
Yeah.
And this was after drinking lots and lots of Helles. It still seemed not that bitter.
Sure.
So,
even within Germany itself, there are very significant differences in the bitterness depending on where you are.
The bitterness, the aroma intensity, the flavor hop contribution. So, I think that we try to make a Pilsner that is hop forward, that's consistent with kind of our West Coast, American craft roots,
right.
But still plant it firmly in Germany by using German malts and German hops, with the exception of that Liberty. But that really, Liberty is about as German you get from an American hop.
So do you call it a German-style Pils, or do you call it an American-style Pils? How do you define that?
The label says Old World with a Modern Twist. That
sounds like a nice way to describe it.
Yeah, to be honest, it's not really a beer that we enter in competition anymore, precisely for that reason. I sort of recognize that it is a tweener beer. It doesn't really fit either style. But if someone had to ask, I would describe it as a German Pils compared to... And it certainly isn't a pre-pro-American Pils, and it certainly is not a Czech Pils.
It seems like we have to put it into one of those buckets, and there doesn't seem to be a predominant kind of American or contemporary or modern Pils category that people want to put their beers into yet here.
Or if it is, when you say contemporary American Pils, and I think people are expecting it to be made with a Citra Pils. Yeah, exactly. So
Highland Park Timbo Pils,
exactly,
or something like that.
Or dry hopped, right?
Right.
And so this is a non-dry hopped Pilsner. So it kind of doesn't quite fit into any of those categories that easily.
There's kind of a soft, fragrant, and like floral fruitiness, to it. That's very subtle, but very endearing, and makes it kind of enjoyable to drink with a character that, you're right, is not as austere as some.
Yeah, again, this is in kind of the Breakside way. We keep the TG up a little bit. I think this finishes at 2.5.
Yeah,
and the BUs are only about 26.
We've got some other beers here on the table that I know you'd love to talk about.
Sure.
You certainly get typecast as a hoppy beer brewer, but that is not the extent of the beers that you brew. Talk to me a little bit about the kind of mixed culture beers and that kind of side of the Breakside program.
So we do a wide range of mixed culture and sour beers. We make a seasonal kettle sour called Passion Fruit Sour that's been a huge hit for us over the last 7 or 8 years now. We continues to do great every summer. And we've also long done a number of different mixed culture wood beers. With what we do now is kind of a series of 6 beers released every year. We just call them the Breakside Sour series, and they're all cuvee style, so we don't do project-based brewing on it. Everything is kind of, we have 1 or 2 wort streams, Everything goes into individual casks. We don't have any foeders, but it's 100% wood fermented, and we don't inoculate the wort. We don't go through a cool ship, so I don't really call it spontaneous brewing, but it's, we're really depending on the resident cultures within in the barrels to take over. And so over time, right, as we select and refill, we're always selecting for the barrels that we enjoy the most, that we think make the most interesting blends. And so that kind of narrows, I think it has created kind of a house character for us over time, or a dominant house culture. And we participated in a study a year or so ago to kind of sequence what the different microorganisms in that culture are. And interestingly, our culture is very, I didn't expect this, but it's very PDO heavy. I thought that we would be predominantly Brett and very, very low sac with medium PDO and lacto. We're actually quite PDO heavy, followed by a lot of Brett, and then not very much lacto or very much sac.
Interesting.
And so, I think it's, if you taste through these beers, part of this is the blending and part of this is just the culture, is that there's not a ton of kind of traditional Brett character, right? And I think part of that is also our panel's preference internally. We have a few folks who are very, very sensitive to phenols and sensitive to kind of some of the more feral and barnyardy type characteristics. And so the Brett characters that we select for tend to be a little bit gentler, softer, fruitier. And I think that plays out in these beers. But the base kind of wort is kind of lambic-inspired turbid mash wort.
We're doing a full turbid mash on these.
As much as we can with on a 30-barrel brew house. But it's a 3-hour boil with a huge portion of unmalted wheat. It's all aged hops.
Yeah.
And then, like I said, straight into the... we go into a blending tank because you can't rack directly off of your whirlpool.
Right.
Or at least that would take forever. And then right into barrels, and it ferments in the barrels. About 6 weeks later, we top off the barrels. And then, we're typically starting to taste barrels at around 15 months to see if they're ready for blending at all.
Talk to me a little bit about your approach to blending. This is one of the more difficult things for any brewer to articulate and put into words. But at the same time, having some language about how to describe this process helps other people think about it. There is that, that kind of taste to language connection that can be hard to accomplish. But as you are tasting through, barrels and this kind of raw product that's coming out of those barrels and thinking about how to construct a blend, kind of walk me through that thought process.
It starts with a goal, right? There has to be some form of goal. You can't just go into a blending session and say, let's see what tastes good, because you'll be there forever and you'll argue, and it's very difficult to figure it out. I think that for us, oftentimes that vision is like, okay, we want to use this particular, we're going to fruit this blend, or we want to use these herbs and spices, or this is going to be an unfruited blend that we want to kind of be in this vein, that we want to be more farmhousey or more barrel forward. So that's something that starts as a conversation between myself and our barrel program manager, Dan Hines. We kind of create a vision for it. And he then, is kind of the barrel meister.
Right.
Will typically go and choose barrels, samples from barrels that he thinks might fit that bill. Yeah. And it's a mix of a few things. There's a little bit of strategy, right? He's looking at stuff that, knowing the age of it, might be trying to pull in some stuff that he's hoping we can work with, and then other stuff that might be based on previous sensory notes. We track that over time that might fit the bill for these types of beers. So we want, let's say we know that we want to do a farmhousey blend, but we want medium-high acidity. So he might go and track down barrels that have been tagged as that in the past that haven't made it into previous blends, or barrels that were enjoyed for that very reason and selected in the past and then have been refilled and re-aged. So it's like, okay, this barrel last time produced this set of characteristics.
It's got a good pedigree,
so that's kind of what comes to the table. A lot of it is this kind of decision-making process that leads us even to the blending session. And then from there, it's kind of just working through in kind of cohorts. We'll say, okay, these 6 casks that Dan selected were all from a fill in November of 2017. Let's taste these. How uniform are they? Are there any that have obvious THP or other defects? Are there ones that seem too young or immature? And a lot of that then now is evolved based on how we know our beers develop and how our flavors develop over time. And then from there, we start picking and choosing and kind of, we'll taste through everything. We'll identify the barrels that have been brought to the table, that, again, the most pleasant to the most people, and start playing with a blend together to see if we can come up with something that honors the best characteristics of each of those barrels.
Yeah.
While also being unique.
It's an interesting thing when you start playing in this style of beer, because there are historical expectations and there are European examples that everyone looks to and that will ultimately always compare your beer to. At the same time, as a maker of these kinds of things, you also want to kind of chart a territory that's not necessarily exactly what somebody else does. For you, how do you define that kind of Breakside approach to sour beer?
I think the goal is definitely to emulate some lambic-like characteristics.
Right.
I mean, those are beers that I have always held in incredibly high regard.
Sure.
And traveled to Belgium, several times and visited those breweries and just super impressed by the flavor profile that they have, as well as some of the American, versions of them, particularly, from Beechwood or from Crooked Stave that I think, or Allagash.
Yeah.
Are really the three that in my mind who hit the mark for emulating that classic lambic-like flavor profile, and trying to take cues from a lot of those producers about how to pursue that. That said, we're really trying to just create interesting beers every time and to keep our customers coming back to the next one. Because I don't think, these are not the beers that keep the lights on for Breakside.
Sure.
And I'm very grateful for that, because I think what that allows us to do is we're really peddling these to our current consumers.
Yeah.
These are people who come into our pubs to drink our IPAs, our lagers, and some of them love sour beers as well. And so we're able to use our brand equity with them. They're trusting us as a producer to sell them these beers that they might not otherwise be willing to try, or would not necessarily kind of give a second pass in the grocery store. And because of that, we don't have to have a easily identifiable agenda or identity with them.
Right. And kind of balancing, when I taste these, there's a light funk to it and a light acidity. These both they seem balanced, definitely towards that lighter side of both of these things.
Yeah.
And obviously we use balance as this kind of catch-all term, and everyone has their own definition of what balance is. But balance can happen at a lot of different pegs along the rung there. And you've got this one definitely on the lighter side of kind of that funk and bready and barnyardy thing, but also that lighter side of acidity with a little bit of malt character to it. Talk to me about, when you start talking about that lambic tradition, they definitely tend to, hit it higher on that kind of bready funk, kind of minerally, cheesy kind of, approach. And this is definitely a subtler, kind of foray into that.
But I think it's a style that I think people sometimes talk as though it's monolithic, and in reality there's a lot of difference. The Cantillon beers are quite different from Driefontein and are different from the Girardin, and the level of funk, the level of acidity, lactic to acetic, level of hop character, they're really kind of all over the place. They're not, within a narrow spectrum, they're pretty different. And so I would agree that these are kind of on that moderate acidity, moderate funk level, for sure. But that's kind of it's what people on our panels have consistently found the most pleasant.
I think I'd be fascinated to throw this into a kind of blind tasting with some more interesting white wine, because I think it's probably in that similar kind of character to it. Some light funky notes, but also some of that kind of vinous character to it. And it definitely is within that kind of taste realm for sure.
Yeah, well, that's interesting you mentioned that, because we have Golden Cluster here, which is that same. So you had Body Electric, which is non-fruited beer. This is now Golden Cluster, which is done with 35% Riesling juice.
Okay.
Actually from Goshi Farms. Who knew that they also not only
your hop farmers are also growing.
Also have a vineyard.
One-stop shop.
Yeah. And so this is, really goes for the kind of vinous and wine-like characteristics.
Yeah.
But yeah, we also downstairs, we did a beer with Matt Van Wyck from Ale Song a few weeks ago as part of this 10th anniversary series that we're doing. And the beers, we're going to call it kind of like orange wine. That's what we ended up going with, because it is kind of that, like, it's light and approachable and easy and spritzy, but it's also got some funk to it. But, I think as a lot of producers of these types of beers recognize, there's a lot of these words that we've used as benchmarks internally in the industry that really are kind of gross to a lot of consumers.
Sure. I think about that every time I use like sweaty, as a description, because to me that's endearing, and I get it in any hoppy beer that kind of pushes that kind of guava papaya kind of character, and I enjoy it because it adds this kind of dirty funk to something that is messy and interesting. But I can imagine that a normal consumer hearing sweaty or sweaty pineapple as a descriptor may not be as endearing to them as it is to some of us in the world.
I think that any brewer who's tasked with kind of doing some level of marketing, right, in their job, or creative direction for a brewery in their job, should spend some time bartending, because you learn those lessons really quickly. That certain words are just big turnoffs.
Right.
We stopped using the word farmhouse long before people stopped using the word farmhouse, because we just realized every time we said that word to a consumer, and this is when I used to bartend, and when our then R&D brewery used to bartend, people, it was just like they were off. Like that was instantly you lost them. And maybe in a different place and different time, it would be more effective. But for us, that was just it was a really eye-opening moment. And there's a lot of those words. Sweaty is certainly one of them. Onion, allium. Any of those kind of savory hop notes, or we try and do everything we can to scrub them for the way we talk to customers, even if we use them internally, because they're meaningful for the kind of common vernacular of brewers.
Right. For a brewer, that provides some balance to some other character here, and it creates this thing that makes sense for a consumer. Selling it is a whole different matter.
Right.
Yeah. In a general sense, what's on the horizon for Breakside? What are you looking forward to over the next year or two?
Well, I think that for us, this year is really exciting as far as collaborations go. We're doing 26 collaborations to celebrate our 10th anniversary, 13 with breweries in-state, 13 out-of-state. All the out-of-state ones are going to package. All the in-state ones are draft only. So over the course of the year, it's probably going to be close to, it's not a huge part of what we do, but it'll probably be 2,500 barrels of these collaboration beers coming out of production. So we're bringing them all here at the Slabtown Pub initially, and then scaling them up. So the first one, we did one with Cloudburst Brewing up in Seattle, and then Fremont. We have that on the table here too. Those are two of the first out-of-state ones. We have one with the Rare Barrel that's coming up that's actually on tap here right now, but that has been brewed down in production. And then in-state, we started with a beer with Sun River, and then with Freem, and then one with Ale Song, and we have collaborations with Barley Browns and Upright coming up next, and a bunch of other of our really close friends in the industry. So that's really fun. I mean, for me, all of my
to justify it to your partners and the CFO, and to say, hey, this is going to be good for business to go hang out and brew a bunch of collaborations with our friends.
It wasn't. It was not a hard sell. It was, that was pretty. It was a pretty easy way to celebrate. But effectively, I'd say that almost all of my creative energy is oriented toward that in the year ahead.
Yeah.
So that's pretty exciting. As a company, we're now employee owned. So we did an ESOP last year, which is really fun for, I think, our entire team. I think it's building a lot of loyalty, and hopefully will keep people for a long, long time. But, we're trying to continue to navigate the waters of a challenging industry right now, where mid-sized breweries, especially breweries who are larger than us, are struggling. And I'm kind of a rah-rah champion of the mid-sized brewery. I think that I fear the retreat to tap rooms. I fear that we are giving up, we as an industry are too easily giving up shelf space that's been hard fought over the last 10 years. And, I think that mid-sized breweries, especially those that are committed to quality, can provide people with careers. They can provide people with a lot of benefits and pay better. I think that they're the breweries that in the next 10 years can push forward advancements in research and quality as some legacy breweries stumble a little bit. So I think that's a lot harder to do when you are a very smaller taproom brewery. And I love those brewers and love those breweries, but I'm also a staunch defender of of breweries like us who want to continue to engage in the fight in the retail sector.
I think you have that there is certainly a point there that with that scale comes some ability to move the broader craft market forward and to contribute back to it, which you all certainly do.
Well, and I'll just continuing on that thought.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree. I think that it's important. If like we make a draft lager every month, it's not Pilsner, right? We've got. We did Dunkel in December.
Yeah.
We've got Darkness Comes, which is our dark Czech lager out right now. We just released a Marzen, which I know it's not supposed to be in March, but we released it in March because I like drinking them in March. And we do a lot of other draft ones. And, I recognize that when we put 60 barrels of Marzen out into the trade, that's 60 barrels that's not going through our pubs. That's out in kegs to bars, that we're trading a little bit. We're asking for a little bit of withdrawal. We're taking withdrawal from our customers and asking them to trust us a little bit. But I think that's how you have to move the needle. You have to have breweries who have kind of the brand equity be willing to spend a little bit of that to push the needle with consumers to see if things work. And they don't always work. But if no one's doing that and we're just giving people more IPA and more IPA every single time, I don't know. It may be better business, but to me that's a lot less interesting. And I don't know that it's good business over the long haul.
I think that's the good point. Like, it may be good business right now if your horizon is the next 3 months or the next 6 months. Is it a good business if your horizon is the next 5 years or the next 10 years? And is there this kind of base of classic beer styles that should continue to exist, the breweries should continue to make and should continue to educate customers about? You can, from a brewery perspective, you can say, well, customers need to be better educated and they need to, understand this. But I mean, let's be honest, the major point of education, as much as we do what we do here at Craft Beer and Brewing and help try to, push that education agenda, most people that are drinking beer are being educated by the places that they're drinking beer at.
Absolutely.
And those breweries are the ones that are doing that kind of educating, in the bigger picture in aggregate, when it's expanded over that. And so, there is, I think it's interesting that you feel some responsibility towards that education process and making some of these things and familiarizing people with those.
Yeah, it's. I feel like we've been very fortunate in the last 10 years to grow the size that we are, and we have a really awesome platform in our pubs, but also through our distribution network. And I think I want to. Use that to try and push for some, push beers forward that we wouldn't have risked 5-10 years or 5 or 6 years ago, and again, I recognize it still has to be, you can't go too far, right? We're not about to send out last year, this was actually, we screwed up. I sent it was only 30 barrels, maybe it was 60 barrels of a buckwheat Schwartz beer on that hit the market March 15th. And it just sat. It sat and sat. But, that was probably a misfire. And we've had a few other ones. But in general, I think that if you're a high quality, if you can produce these beers at a, high quality, and I would certainly never put us in the league of, elite lager producing breweries in this country, but we make a lot of lager. And I think we do a solid job on a lot of these beers, and I think we're doing a good introductory Vienna lager, a good introductory version, of a dark Czech lager, and that hopefully people enjoy that, recognize it, and then they're willing to try one again sometime in the future.
Yeah. So what does success look like for Breakside Brewery? When will you know that you've achieved it, or do you feel like you have?
That's a very difficult question. I'm kind of...
That's why I left it for the last one.
I'm a little, I'm always kind of a tinkerer and a little restless. I think that for us, though, as a company, it's defined by sustainability is, in perpetuity and quality of life for our employees. Our motto is seek and enjoy. Our number one core value here is for us internally is enjoy life at work and while you're away. And so to be able to provide for our employees in a way that allows for that, both the work and the enjoyment and the being away from work, I think is kind of our goal, and to be able to continue to do that at whatever size is really important for us. Beyond that, I think it's defined a lot by making sure that we're running a successful business. And of course, we want to contribute at the forefront of kind of beer quality and innovation. And I think it's something a lot of breweries of our size like to do.
Yeah. That's the grown-up answer, right? That it's funny how at first it's I want to win some awards and feel the validation, and then as you get further into this, it's I want to be a good business person, and I want to treat our employees right, and I want to treat our customers right, and higher sales come because we're creating compelling products for our customers, and that's the validation that ultimately matters.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, Ben Edmunds, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
This week.
Yeah.
If people want to learn more about Breakside, where do they find you?
They can go to breakside.com. You can follow us on Instagram also as @Breakside Brews, which is also our Twitter handle. So all three.
Cool. G&D Chillers is big enough to produce and small enough to care. Old Orchard invites you to step up your fruit game. SS Brewtech is advancing brewing equipment design, performance, and quality. And Captain Pabst Seabird IPA is now available exclusively in Wisconsin and Chicago. If you've enjoyed our conversation and enjoyed listening to this podcast, please go to beerandbrewing.com, click on the subscribe button, and become a subscriber to the magazine. Ben Edmunds, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
It's been such a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Cheers.
Cheers.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media @craftbeerbrew.